The moment the car crashed into me, my world shattered. Not just my bones, but every shred of hope I held. I lay on the cold asphalt, breath ragged, watching the gray New York skyline blur above me. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my purse like a cruel joke. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I was wrong. Dead wrong. For decades, I lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Corona, Queens, surrounded by the familiar sounds of subway trains and neighbors speaking in languages that painted the walls with warmth. My world smelled of instant coffee and old photographs, of dreams deferred and hopes carefully folded away like winter clothes. Every morning, I'd wake at 5:30 to the buzz of my ancient alarm clock. My routine never changed. Coffee first, black because milk was getting expensive. Then I'd check my phone, hoping for a good morning text from my daughter Sarah, or maybe a call from my son Michael. The silence was always deafening. My apartment walls were covered with their pictures. Sarah's graduation from Columbia, where I worked 3 jobs to pay her tuition. Michael's wedding in the Hamptons, where I wasn't invited to the rehearsal dinner because there wasn't enough room. Their children's school photos, grandchildren I saw maybe twice a year if I was lucky. That Tuesday morning in March started like any other. The sky was the color of old concrete, typical for New York in early spring. I had bundled up in my worn navy coat, the one with the loose button I kept meaning to fix. I was walking to catch the Q46 bus to my cleaning job at the office building on Lexington Avenue. Even at my age, I couldn't afford to retire. Not when Sarah needed money for her mortgage, and Michael expected me to help with his kids' private school fees. The impact came from nowhere. One moment I was stepping off the curb at Northern Boulevard, and the next I was flying through the air like a broken bird. Time moved in slow motion. I remember thinking how strange it was that the sky looked so peaceful from that angle, even as the pain exploded through my body like lightning. When I hit the pavement, everything went quiet except for the ringing in my ears. Blood pooled beneath my head, warm and sticky. My right leg was bent at an impossible angle and I could taste copper in my mouth. People gathered around me, their faces blurred and concerned. Someone was calling 911. Another person was asking if I was conscious, but all I could think about was my phone. It was buzzing in my purse, which had landed a few feet away. My first thought wasn't about the pain or the fear. It was hope. Maybe Sarah was calling. Maybe she had that mother's intuition, that invisible thread between us pulling tight at the moment I needed her most. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They were young and kind, treating me with the gentle efficiency of people who understood that every second mattered. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, one of them handed me my purse. "Your phone's been buzzing like crazy," she said with a smile. "Must be worried family." In the ambulance, as we raced through Queens toward Elmhurst Hospital, I finally managed to check my messages with trembling fingers. There were 17 missed calls from an unknown number, probably spam. One text from my neighbor Mrs. Chen asking if I had extra sugar, and then, buried beneath the notification chaos, one message from Sarah. I opened it with the kind of desperate hope that only mothers understand. My heart was already racing from the accident, but what I read made it stop entirely. "I'm at my MIL's spa day. Let me know if she dies." I read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that resembled love, but they didn't. The message had been sent 20 minutes after the accident. Somehow word had already reached her. Maybe through the emergency contact list in my wallet. Maybe a kind stranger had called her after finding her number in my phone. And this was her response. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital emergency bay, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with my injured bones. It was the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. the last thread of hope that had kept me believing my children loved me as much as I loved them. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story didn't start with a car accident. It started 47 years ago when I held my daughter Sarah for the first time and promised her the moon. It started with every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I didn't have but somehow found. I raised Sarah and Michael alone after their father left when Sarah was 8 and Michael was 5. He walked out one Thursday morning after breakfast, leaving nothing but a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I can't do this anymore." No explanation, no forwarding address, just the weight of 2 confused children and a stack of bills I couldn't pay. Those early years were a blur of double shifts and babysitter searches, of mac and cheese dinners and secondhand clothes. I worked as a night janitor at a Manhattan office building, taking the subway home at dawn while my kids were still sleeping. During the day, I cleaned houses in wealthy neighborhoods in Long Island, watching other people's children play in yards that cost more than I'd ever see. But I told myself it was worth it. Every backbreaking hour, every moment of exhaustion was an investment in their future. When Sarah wanted to take ballet lessons, I found the money. When Michael needed a computer for school, I worked extra weekends. When Sarah got accepted to Columbia, I took out loans I'm still paying today. I remember the day she graduated. I sat in that massive auditorium, wearing my best dress, a navy blue one I'd bought at a thrift store and tailored myself. I watched my daughter walk across that stage, diploma in hand, and I wept with pride. She was the first person in our family to graduate college. She was going to have the life I never could. After the ceremony, she hugged me briefly, barely long enough for the photographer to capture the moment. "Thanks, Mom," she said, but her eyes were already searching the crowd for her friends, for her new world that suddenly seemed too sophisticated for a cleaning lady from Queens. Michael followed a different path. He went to trade school, became an electrician, and married young. His wife Jennifer was sweet enough, but there was always a distance there, like I was something to be managed rather than loved. They had 2 children, Emma and Lucas. Beautiful kids who called me Grandma Eleanor with the kind of formal politeness usually reserved for strangers. For years, I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. The fact that my role in those lives seemed to shrink with each passing year wasn't rejection, it was success. I had raised independent, capable adults. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I sat alone in my apartment eating dinner in front of the television, I knew something was wrong. Love shouldn't feel like a transaction. Family shouldn't feel like a part-time job I was slowly being fired from. The phone calls started becoming requests. "Mom, I'm a little short on my mortgage this month. Could you help?" Sarah's voice would take on that sweet, little girl quality that used to make me melt. How could I say no? She was struggling, working as a marketing coordinator for a small firm in Manhattan. The rent was astronomical, the cost of living crushing. I'd check my savings account, the modest nest egg I'd built up dollar by dollar over decades, and transfer whatever she needed. Sometimes it was $300. Sometimes it was $1,000. I never asked when she'd pay it back because asking felt like putting a price on love. Michael was different, but no less expensive. His requests came through Jennifer, which somehow made them feel more legitimate. Michael's truck broke down and he needs reliable transportation for work. Could you help with a down payment? Or, the kids need new school clothes. And money's tight this month. I helped every time. What else was family money for? The pattern established itself so gradually I barely noticed it happening. Sarah would call when she needed something. Michael would visit when Jennifer sent him to pick up a check. The grandchildren would appear for birthdays and Christmas, polite and grateful for exactly as long as it took to unwrap presents. And slowly, quietly, my savings account drained. But it wasn't just about the money. That was only part of the picture. The real heartbreak was in the small moments, the casual cruelties that accumulated like dust. Last Christmas, I spent 3 days preparing dinner for the whole family. I bought groceries I couldn't afford, cooked dishes from scratch, set the table with china that had belonged to my mother. Sarah showed up 2 hours late with an excuse about traffic that didn't quite make sense. Michael arrived with Jennifer and the kids, but jumped up every few minutes to check his phone. The children ate quickly and disappeared into the living room with their devices. Jennifer helped clear plates but spent most of the time talking to her mother on the phone. And Sarah, my firstborn, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, sat at my kitchen table scrolling through social media while I tried to make conversation. "Mom, do you have the Wi-Fi password?" she asked without looking up. I gave it to her, watching as she immediately returned to her phone. I'd spent months planning this meal, this moment. I'd imagined warm conversation and laughter, stories shared and memories made. Instead, I sat at my own table feeling like an inconvenience. When they left, Sarah kissed my cheek quickly. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. We should do this more often." But her eyes were already on her phone again, already somewhere else. I cleaned up alone, washing dishes and putting away leftovers that would last me a week. The apartment felt cavernous in their absence, filled with the ghost of conversations that never happened. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of my Queens neighborhood, sirens in the distance, neighbors talking on stoops, the endless rhythm of the city that never sleeps. I realized I was living in a house of echoes, surrounded by people who saw me as a convenience rather than a person. But still, I made excuses. They were busy. Modern life was demanding. Technology changed how people connected. I was from a different generation, with different expectations. The wake-up calls came in small doses at first, like the time I was hospitalized with pneumonia 2 winters ago. I called Sarah from my hospital bed, voice weak, but trying to sound strong. "Hi, honey. I'm at Elmhurst Hospital. Nothing serious, but thought you should know." "Oh, no, Mom. I'm so sorry. I'm actually in Miami for work this week, but I'll call and check on you." She never called. Michael did visit once, staying for 20 minutes and spending most of that time on a work call in the hallway. When he left, he patted my hand and promised to check on me when I got home. I waited 3 weeks for that check-in call. It never came. I discharged myself on a Thursday afternoon, took the bus home to my empty apartment, and spent the next week recovering alone. Mrs. Chen from next door brought me soup once, and that small kindness meant more to me than all the expensive gifts my children had given me over the years. Or the time I fell down the stairs in my building and sprained my ankle. I called both my children, explained that I was injured and scared. Sarah was at a friend's birthday party and couldn't leave. Michael was watching a game and suggested I call 911 if it was really serious. I limped to the emergency room alone, waited 4 hours to be seen, and took a taxi home with crutches and a prescription I couldn't afford to fill. That night, sitting on my couch with my ankle elevated and throbbing, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take them to notice? The answer scared me more than any physical pain ever could. But even then, even with all the evidence piling up like snow in a New York winter, I kept making excuses. I kept believing that love was patient, that family was complicated, that my expectations were too high for the modern world. The final straw came 6 months before the accident. I had been saving for something special, something just for me. A small cruise to the Caribbean, the kind of trip I'd dreamed about for decades, but never allowed myself to take. It wasn't extravagant, just 7 days of sunshine and rest, a chance to see something beyond the borders of Queens. I had saved $8,000 over 2 years, hiding money away $20 at a time. It was my secret nest egg, my reward for a lifetime of selflessness. Then Sarah called on a Thursday evening, crying. She'd been laid off from her job. Her savings were gone. She was going to lose her apartment unless she could come up with 3 months' rent immediately. "Mom, I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. I've tried everything else. You're my only hope." The tears in her voice broke my heart. How could I vacation while my daughter was facing homelessness? How could I be so selfish? I transferred the money that night. 3 weeks later, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw photos from Sarah's weekend in the Hamptons. She was at a spa resort with her friend Rebecca, both of them glowing in fluffy bathrobes, champagne glasses raised to the camera. The caption read, "Sometimes you just need to treat yourself. Self-care. Best life. Grateful." I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the desperate woman who had called me crying with the relaxed, radiant person in the image. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I called her that evening. "Sarah, honey, I saw your photos. I'm confused. Didn't you say you were struggling financially?" There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had that edge I was beginning to recognize. "Mom, Rebecca surprised me with this weekend. I couldn't say no. It would have been rude. Besides, I needed some stress relief after everything I've been through." "But what about your apartment?" "Oh, that worked out. I talked to my landlord, and we worked something out." The lie was so casual, so effortless. It took my breath away. My $8,000, 2 years of careful saving, had funded what appeared to be a luxury weekend while I ate peanut butter sandwiches and canceled my cable to save money. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I went to my computer and looked up my daughter's social media accounts going back several months. What I found was a catalog of expensive dinners, designer purchases, weekend trips, and luxury experiences that painted a very different picture from the struggling young woman who regularly called me for financial help. I found photos of the designer handbag she'd carried to our Christmas dinner, the same Christmas where she'd mentioned being too broke to contribute to groceries. I found pictures of the expensive wine she'd shared with friends the same week she'd asked me to help with her electric bill. The pattern was undeniable. I wasn't helping my daughter through temporary hardships. I was funding a lifestyle she couldn't afford while I lived like a pauper. But even with this evidence, I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I made excuses. Maybe she'd gotten some freelance work. Maybe Rebecca really had paid for those trips. Maybe I was misunderstanding the timeline. Because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging something too painful to bear. My own daughter was lying to me, manipulating me, stealing from me with the weapon I'd given her. My unconditional love. The realization might have stayed buried forever, if not for what happened 3 weeks before the accident. I was cleaning out my desk drawer when I found an old bank statement that had been misfiled. It was from 2 years ago, showing a balance that made me do a double take. I compared it to my current balance and felt my stomach drop. In 2 years, I had given my children over $30,000. $30,000 I'd saved from decades of minimum wage work, money that represented years of my life, sacrifices I'd made, dreams I'd deferred. I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bank statements, adding up transfers and cash withdrawals marked Sarah Help and Michael Emergency. The total was staggering. It was more than most people my age had in retirement savings. It was more than I'd ever spent on myself in my entire life. And what did I have to show for it? I looked around my apartment with new eyes. The furniture was decades old, held together with tape and prayer. My clothes were either thrift store finds or so old they qualified as vintage. My refrigerator was empty except for the essentials. I was living like someone in poverty while funding my children's middle-class aspirations. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to talk to them, both of them. I was going to lay out the numbers, explain my situation, and ask for some acknowledgement of what I'd sacrificed for their comfort. I rehearsed the conversation in my head for days. I would be gentle but clear. I would express my needs without making them feel guilty. I would ask for understanding, for some consideration of my own future, for maybe a small repayment plan that wouldn't burden them, but would help me regain some financial stability. I called Sarah first on a Saturday morning when I knew she'd be relaxed. "Hi, honey. Do you have a few minutes to talk? There's something important I need to discuss with you." "Sure, Mom, but make it quick. I'm meeting friends for brunch in an hour." I took a deep breath and launched into my carefully prepared speech. I explained my financial situation gently and honestly. I told her about the bank statements, about the total amount I'd given over the years, about my own needs as an aging woman living alone. "I'm not asking for everything back," I said carefully. "I understand that money between family isn't always a loan, but I'm hoping we can work out some kind of plan where maybe you could help me occasionally, or at least not need my help quite so often." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Mom," she said finally, and her voice was cold in a way that made my blood freeze. "I can't believe you're actually keeping track of money you gave me. That's not what family does. That's not what mothers do." "I'm not keeping track to be mean," I said quickly. "I'm just trying to—" "You're trying to make me feel guilty for accepting help from my own mother. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" The conversation spiraled from there. According to Sarah, I was being manipulative, petty, and cruel. I was turning love into a business transaction. I was making her feel terrible about accepting help during genuinely difficult times. "Besides," she added, "it's not like you were using that money for anything important. What do you need money for anyway? Your rent is cheap. You don't go anywhere. You don't do anything. At least I was using it to build a life." The words hit me like physical blows. Not only was she refusing to acknowledge my sacrifice, she was dismissing my entire existence as unworthy of financial consideration. I tried to explain again, more desperately this time. I told her about my fears of aging without savings, about the rising cost of healthcare, about my dreams of maybe traveling or having some small luxuries in my final years. "Mom, you're being dramatic. You're healthy. You have your apartment. You have family who loves you. What else do you need?" When I hung up that call, I sat in my kitchen shaking. The conversation with Michael went even worse. He accused me of trying to guilt trip him and suggested I should be grateful that my children still spoke to me at all. "Lots of old people die alone, forgotten by their families," he said, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "You should think about that before you start making demands." For the first time in my life, I saw my children clearly. They weren't struggling young adults who occasionally needed help. They were fully grown people who had discovered that manipulating my love was easier than managing their own finances. I wasn't a mother to them. I was a resource to be exploited until it was exhausted. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I'd kept locked away for decades. I cried for the mother who had given everything and received nothing in return. I cried for the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion for children who saw her as an ATM. I cried for all the years I'd spent making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. But somewhere in that flood of grief, something else emerged. Anger. Clean, pure, righteous anger at being taken advantage of by the people who were supposed to love me most. For the first time in my 72 years, I felt the stirring of something that had been dormant so long I barely recognized it. The will to fight back. The accident happened 3 weeks later, on that gray Tuesday morning when I was walking to catch the bus. As I lay on the pavement, bleeding and broken, I realized that the physical pain was nothing compared to what I'd been enduring emotionally. At least the car that hit me was honest about its impact. In the emergency room, as doctors examined my injuries and nurses asked about my pain levels, I kept thinking about that text message. "Let me know if she dies." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm on my way." Not even, "I'm sorry this happened." Just a casual request to be notified of my death, sandwiched between a spa day update and what I imagined was complete indifference to my suffering. I had a concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured leg, and extensive bruising. The doctors wanted to keep me for observation, at least overnight. They asked who they should call. Who would be caring for me when I was discharged? I gave them Sarah's number because that's what you do. She's my daughter. She's my emergency contact. Surely, despite our recent argument, she would come when I truly needed her. She never showed up. Michael arrived 6 hours after I was admitted, staying just long enough to sign some paperwork and assure the medical staff that I had family support. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't hold my hand or stroke my hair or do any of the things I had done for him countless times when he was sick as a child. Instead, he stood at the foot of my hospital bed, reading something on his phone, while a nurse explained my discharge instructions. "Mom, I can't stay tonight," he said without looking up. "Jennifer's got a work thing and someone needs to watch the kids. But you'll be fine. It's just bruises and stuff, right?" Just bruises and stuff. 3 broken ribs, a fractured leg, and a head injury that had left me dizzy and nauseous were dismissed as minor inconveniences that shouldn't interfere with his evening plans. "Will Sarah be coming?" I asked weakly. "I don't think so. She said she's been really busy with work. Too busy for her injured mother, but not too busy for a spa day. That first night alone in my apartment after the accident was the longest of my life. Every movement sent shafts of pain through my body. I couldn't lift my arms to reach things in my kitchen cabinets. I couldn't bend to pick up the pills I dropped. I couldn't shower or change my clothes without help. I had been given a list of warning signs to watch for, symptoms that would indicate a serious complication requiring immediate medical attention. As I lay in my bed, every headache and wave of nausea felt potentially life-threatening. I was scared, and I was alone, and I was finally completely done with pretending this was normal. The next morning, through the fog of pain medication, I did something that felt revolutionary. I changed Sarah's contact information in my phone. Instead of Sarah, daughter, I changed it to just Sarah. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming some essential part of myself. Then I did something even more radical. I called my bank. "I'd like to set up a new savings account," I told the representative. "One that requires 2 forms of identification and a security code to access. No online transfers, no phone transfers. I want to make it as difficult as possible to move money out of this account." The representative was puzzled, but accommodating. Over the next week, as I recovered in painful solitude, I moved the small amount of money I had left into this new protected account. For the first time in years, I had savings that my children couldn't access with a sad story and emotional manipulation. It felt like putting a lock on my front door after years of leaving it wide open. But the real transformation was happening inside my head. As I lay on my couch day after day, dependent on the kindness of neighbors who barely knew me better than my own children did, I started seeing my life from a different perspective. Mrs. Chen brought me soup every evening for a week. She didn't speak much English, but she would check my bandages and help me to the bathroom when walking was too painful. She never asked for anything in return, never made me feel like a burden, never suggested that helping me was inconvenient. Mr. Rodriguez from downstairs offered to do my grocery shopping, refusing to accept money for gas or take payment for his time. When I tried to give him cash for the groceries, he looked genuinely insulted. "Family helps family," he said in his careful English. "You are good neighbor. We take care of you." Family helps family. The words echoed in my mind for days. These people, who owed me nothing, were treating me with more consideration than my own children had shown in years. I started to understand something that should have been obvious, but had been obscured by decades of maternal conditioning. Love is not supposed to be a one-way transaction. Families are supposed to help each other, not just children extracting resources from parents until they're exhausted. The turning point came 2 weeks after the accident. I was finally able to walk short distances without excruciating pain, and I decided to venture out to the small bodega on the corner to buy coffee. It was my first independent trip since the accident, and I felt nervous but determined. As I was paying for my items, my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and for just a moment my heart leaped with the old, familiar hope. Maybe she was calling to check on me. Maybe she'd realized how badly she'd handled my injury. Maybe she wanted to apologize, to help, to be the daughter I'd raised her to be. "Hi, honey," I answered, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. "Mom, thank God you answered. I have been trying to figure out how to pay my credit card bill, and I'm completely stuck. I know we had that weird conversation a few weeks ago, but this is a real emergency. Could you help me out with maybe $1,500? I stood in that bodega, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my neighborhood, and felt something die inside me. Not the last of my love for her. I wasn't sure that would ever completely disappear, but the last of my willingness to pretend this was acceptable. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I was hit by a car 2 weeks ago." "I know, Mom, and that's terrible. But you're obviously fine if you're answering your phone. This is really urgent. My credit card payment is due tomorrow." Obviously fine. 3 broken ribs, a fractured leg, a concussion, and 2 weeks of recovery in isolation, and I was obviously fine because I could answer a phone call. "I can't help you with money right now," I said. "What do you mean you can't help? You're my mother. This is what mothers do." There it was again. The assumption that my entire purpose in life was to solve her problems, combined with the complete dismissal of my own needs, my own life, my own humanity. "Being your mother doesn't mean being your bank account," I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a foreign language I was just learning. The conversation that followed was ugly. Sarah accused me of being selfish, of punishing her for our earlier argument, of not caring about her well-being. She called me bitter and mean-spirited. She threatened to cut off contact entirely if I didn't help her. And for the first time in our relationship, I didn't crumble. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said simply, and then I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I hung up the phone. Standing in that bodega, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of normal life, I realized that I had just crossed a line I'd never even known existed. I had centered my own needs above my daughter's wants. I had refused to sacrifice my well-being for her convenience. I had said no. The word felt foreign but powerful, like discovering I had a superpower I'd never known I possessed. That evening, Michael called. Apparently, Sarah had tattled to him about my unreasonable behavior. He was angrier than I'd ever heard him. "What's gotten into you?" he demanded. "Sarah told me about your conversation today, and I can't believe how selfish you're being. She's your daughter. She needs help, and you're playing games." "I'm not playing games," I said. "I'm trying to recover from being hit by a car, and I can't afford to keep giving away money I don't have." "You have money. You've always had money when we needed it before." "That money came from somewhere, Michael. It came from me working extra shifts, from me not buying things I needed, from me having no savings for my own future." "That's what parents do," he said dismissively. "They sacrifice for their children. It's not like you need much anyway." There it was again. The casual dismissal of my existence, my needs, my right to have desires and dreams and security in my old age. "I'm 72 years old," I said. "I'm not going to live forever, and when I'm gone, I don't want to leave this world having spent my final years struggling financially while my children lived comfortably off my labor." "Jesus, Mom, you're being so dramatic. We're not asking you to die in poverty. We're just asking for help occasionally." Occasionally. I thought about my bank statements, about the $30,000, about the consistent pattern of requests that had drained my accounts and left me unable to handle even a minor emergency. "This conversation is over," I said, and I hung up on him too. 2 phone calls, 2 hang-ups, 2 relationships fundamentally changed forever. That night, I sat in my living room with a legal pad and started making lists. I wrote down everything I'd given them over the years, not to keep score, but to understand the magnitude of what I'd been doing to myself. I wrote down my current expenses and my income, calculating how much longer I could survive if I stopped working entirely. Then I wrote down my dreams. The trips I wanted to take, the classes I wanted to attend, the small luxuries I'd never allowed myself. For the first time in decades, I let myself imagine a life where my money was spent on my own happiness instead of other people's convenience. It was a short list, modest and achievable. A cruise to somewhere warm, a photography class, maybe a small apartment with better lighting and a view of something other than the brick wall across the courtyard. None of these dreams were extravagant, but they all required something I'd never had: the belief that I deserved to spend money on my own happiness. Looking at that list, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. I was going to live for myself. Not exclusively, not selfishly, but genuinely. I was going to treat my own needs as legitimate and important. I was going to learn to matter to myself. The phone rang constantly for the next few days. Sarah called with increasingly desperate stories about financial emergencies. Michael called with guilt trips about family obligations and threats about grandchildren I might never see again. Even Jennifer called, trying to play peacemaker while simultaneously explaining why I should give them money. I let every call go to voicemail. Listening to those messages was like hearing a foreign language I'd once been fluent in. The emotional manipulation, the assumption that my money was theirs by right, the casual cruelty disguised as family dynamics, it all sounded so clear now that I wasn't responding to it in real time. One message from Sarah was particularly enlightening. "Mom, I don't understand what's happened to you since your accident. You've become a completely different person, and it's really scary. The mother I grew up with would never treat her children this way. I'm starting to think you might have had brain damage that they didn't catch. Maybe you should see a doctor about personality changes, because this isn't like you at all." Brain damage. She was suggesting I had brain damage because I'd refused to give her credit card money while I was recovering from being hit by a car. But in a way, she was right. I had become a different person. The accident had shaken something loose in me. Some deep acceptance of mistreatment that I'd carried for so long it felt like part of my skeleton. For the first time in my adult life, I was thinking clearly about my relationships, my worth, my future. And what I saw horrified me. I had raised two people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. I had taught them through decades of behavior that my needs didn't matter. My money was theirs, and my love was unconditional no matter how poorly they treated me. I had created this monster, and now I had to decide whether to keep feeding it or let it starve. 3 weeks after the accident, I felt strong enough to take the subway into Manhattan. I had an appointment with a lawyer at a legal aid clinic, something I'd arranged during one of my sleepless nights of planning my new life. The lawyer was a young woman named Amanda who listened to my story with the kind of professional calm that came from hearing terrible things every day. I explained my situation carefully, trying not to sound like a bitter old woman complaining about ungrateful children. "I want to protect what's left of my money," I said. "I want to make sure that if something happens to me, my assets go where I choose them to go, not where people assume they should go." Amanda nodded. "You'd be surprised how often I see situations like this. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' resources, parents who've been conditioned to believe that saying no makes them bad people." She helped me set up a will that reflected my actual wishes rather than societal expectations. She explained my rights regarding my own money, my own property, my own decisions. She made it clear that choosing not to financially support adult children wasn't selfish or unusual. It was normal. "Your money is yours," she said simply. "You earned it, you saved it, and you get to decide how it's used. End of story." Walking out of that legal aid office, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I had a professional confirmation of something I'd started to suspect. I wasn't crazy, selfish, or mean. I was just a woman who'd finally learned to value herself. But the real test was still coming. 2 months after the accident, Sarah called with news. Mom, I've been doing some thinking since our argument, and I want to apologize. I know I said some harsh things, and I realize I haven't been as considerate as I should have been about your situation. For a moment, I felt the old familiar flutter of hope. Maybe she really had learned something. Maybe the crisis had forced her to reevaluate our relationship. Maybe we could build something healthier together. I appreciate that, honey, I said carefully. I want to make it up to you. I was thinking maybe we could plan a nice dinner together, just the two of us. My treat. And I wanted to suggest something that might help both of us. Here it comes, I thought. I've been looking into reverse mortgages, and I think it might be a perfect solution for you. You could get a significant amount of money from your apartment equity, which would help you feel more financially secure, and then you wouldn't have to worry about money when we occasionally need help. A reverse mortgage. She wanted me to mortgage my apartment, the only asset I owned outright, the only security I had, so that I could afford to keep giving her money. Sarah, I said slowly, let me make sure I understand. You want me to borrow against my apartment so I can afford to give you money. It's not borrowing, Mom. It's accessing your equity. The money is just sitting there not helping anyone. This way, you'd have cash flow, and our family could function normally again. Our family could function normally. Translation: I could go back to funding her lifestyle while she treated me like a convenient ATM. And what happens when I die? I asked. Well, the bank would own the apartment, but you won't need it anymore, and we'll inherit whatever money is left in your accounts. It's a win-win situation. A win-win situation where I gave up my housing security so she could have spending money, and my death became a financial benefit for her. I sat in my kitchen, looking at the same walls that had witnessed decades of my sacrifices, and felt something settle into place. This wasn't grief anymore, or anger, or disappointment. This was clarity. Sarah, I said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once. Okay. I will not be getting a reverse mortgage. I will not be giving you any more money. I will not be treating my life like a resource to be consumed for your benefit. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be based on love and respect, not on what I can provide for you financially. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Mom, you're really starting to scare me. This isn't like you at all. You're right, I said. It's not like me. The old me would have probably considered that reverse mortgage. The old me would have found a way to keep giving you money even if it meant compromising my own security. But that woman was slowly killing herself, trying to buy love from people who saw her as a bank account. That's not fair. It's completely fair. Sarah, in the 2 months since I was hit by a car, you have visited me exactly 0 times. You have called to check on my recovery exactly 0 times. But you have asked me for money 3 times and suggested I mortgage my apartment once. That tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to you. Another silence, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold. Fine. If that's how you want to be, don't expect to hear from me again. And don't expect to be part of your grandchildren's lives. I won't have them exposed to this kind of toxicity. Toxicity. Refusing to impoverish myself for her convenience was toxic. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said. And I was sorry. But I wasn't sorry enough to change my mind. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing what had just happened. My daughter had just threatened to cut me off from my grandchildren because I wouldn't mortgage my apartment to give her money. The woman who had carried her in my body for 9 months, who had worked multiple jobs to put her through college, who had given her $30,000 over the past 2 years, was now being labeled toxic for setting financial boundaries. But instead of the crushing despair I expected to feel, something else emerged. Relief. For the first time in decades, I knew exactly where I stood. The relationship had been stripped of all pretense, all false affection, all manufactured obligations. We both understood what it really was, a financial arrangement disguised as family love, and I was withdrawing from that arrangement. The confrontation with Michael came a week later. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, letting himself in with the key I'd given him years earlier for emergencies. I was sitting at my kitchen table working on a jigsaw puzzle, a small indulgence I'd bought for myself now that I wasn't sending all my discretionary income to my children, when I heard my front door open. "Mom?" he called out. "In the kitchen," I replied, not getting up. He appeared in my doorway looking agitated and uncomfortable. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About this whole situation with Sarah. She's really upset, Mom. She's been crying for days. You've really hurt her." I looked at my son, the little boy I'd once comforted through nightmares and scraped knees, and saw a middle-aged man who'd somehow convinced himself that my refusal to be exploited was an act of cruelty against his sister. "I'm sorry she's upset," I said, "but I'm not responsible for her emotional reaction to my financial boundaries." "Financial boundaries? Is that what you're calling this? Mom, you're her mother. You don't get to just cut off your children because you're in a bad mood." "I haven't cut off anyone. I've simply stopped giving money I can't afford to give." "You can afford it. You've always been able to afford it before." "Michael, sit down." Something in my tone must have surprised him because he actually complied, taking the seat across from me at my small kitchen table. "I want to show you something," I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared for this exact conversation. Inside were photocopies of my bank statements from the past 3 years, with all the transfers to my children highlighted in yellow. I spread the papers in front of him like evidence in a trial. "This is how much money I've given you and your sister over the past 3 years, I said, pointing to the total I'd calculated at the bottom of the page. $37,400. Michael's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "This is how much money I have left in my savings," I continued, showing him my current balance. $832. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers. "Do you understand what this means?" I asked gently. "It means that I gave away nearly all of my life savings to help my children, and now I'm living paycheck to paycheck at 72 years old." "I didn't know it was that much," he said quietly. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel guilty. But I want you to understand why I can't keep doing this. I'm not trying to punish anyone or be vindictive. I'm trying to survive." Michael looked at the papers for a long time before speaking again. "But Mom, we didn't ask you to give us all your money. We just asked for help when we needed it." There it was, the inability to connect his individual requests to their cumulative impact. The assumption that because each ask was reasonable in isolation, the total effect shouldn't matter. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He nodded. "In the past year, how many times have you called me just to talk? Not to ask for anything, not because of an emergency, just to check in and see how I'm doing." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I could see him thinking, searching his memory. "I'm not trying to trick you," I said. "I'm genuinely curious." "I don't know," he said finally. "I'm busy with work and the kids. You know how it is." "I do know how it is, but I also know that you found time to call me 4 times in the past year asking for money, and 0 times just to see if I was okay." And the math was stark and undeniable. "And when I was hit by that car," I continued, "do you know what your first concern was when you came to the hospital?" "Making sure you were okay?" "No. Your first concern was making sure someone could sign paperwork so you wouldn't have to stay long. You spent more time on your phone that day than talking to me." Michael's face was reddening. "That's not fair. I was dealing with a lot that day." "You were dealing with a lot? I was the one hit by a car." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of all these unspoken truths settling between us like dust. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. I want you to see me as a person instead of a resource. I want you to consider my needs occasionally. I want phone calls that aren't requests for money. I want visits that aren't pickup appointments for checks. And if I can't do that? The question hung in the air like a challenge and a threat. Then I guess we'll both learn what kind of relationship we really have, I said. After Michael left, I did something I'd never done before in my adult life. I called in sick to work, not because I was physically ill, but because I needed time to think, to process, to figure out what came next. I spent the day walking around my neighborhood with fresh eyes. I noticed things I'd been too tired or distracted to see before. The small community garden where elderly Puerto Rican men grew tomatoes and argued about baseball. The beauty salon where Dominican women gathered to gossip and laugh. The small cafe run by a Greek family that had been serving the same coffee for 30 years. This was my world, my community, my place. I'd been so focused on being a mother to ungrateful children that I'd forgotten to be a neighbor, a friend, a person with interests and connections beyond my family. That evening, I did something revolutionary. I went to the cafe and sat at a small table with a book and a cup of coffee. I wasn't waiting for anyone, wasn't meeting anyone, wasn't doing anything productive. I was just existing in public, taking up space, enjoying my own company. An elderly Greek woman at the next table smiled at me. "Good book?" she asked. "Just started it," I replied. "But yes, I think it will be." "I'm Maria," she said. "I see you walking in neighborhood all the time, but we never talk." "I'm Eleanor. I've been walking past your cafe for 10 years, but I never thought to stop in." 10 years? She laughed. Better late than never, no? We talked for an hour about books, about the neighborhood, about nothing and everything. When I finally left, Maria hugged me goodbye like an old friend. "You come back soon," she said. "Tuesday is my day here. We talk more." Walking home, I realized I'd just had the most pleasant social interaction I'd experienced in months. No one had asked me for anything, criticized me for anything, or made me feel like my primary value was financial. Maria had simply enjoyed my company, and I had enjoyed hers. It was what normal relationships felt like. But the final confrontation was still coming. A month later, I received a phone call from Jennifer, my daughter-in-law. It was the first time she'd ever called me directly, and I knew it couldn't be good news. "Eleanor, we need to talk about what's been happening with the family." "Okay. I think you've been misunderstanding some things. Michael and Sarah love you very much, but they're hurt and confused by your recent behavior." I almost laughed. Jennifer was going to explain to me how my own children felt about me. They're worried that you're isolating yourself and making decisions based on anger instead of love. What decisions are those? Well, your refusal to help them when they're struggling financially, your threats to cut them off, the way you've been treating their requests for help like personal attacks. I listened to her recite this narrative, a story where I was the villain, where my setting boundaries was emotional abuse, where my children's financial demands were reasonable and my refusal was cruel. "Jennifer," I said when she finished, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. If your mother had given you $40,000 over the past few years, and then she was hit by a car and none of her children visited her in the hospital, would you think that was appropriate?" "That's different." "How is it different?" "Well, your children have their own lives, their own responsibilities. They can't drop everything every time you have a problem. But I can drop everything every time they have a financial problem? That's what family does. That's what parents do." There it was again. The assumption that family obligation only flowed in one direction, that being a parent meant permanent servitude, that my needs were inherently less important than theirs. "Jennifer, let me be very clear about something. I love my children, but I will no longer set myself on fire to keep them warm. If they want a relationship with me, it needs to be based on mutual respect and consideration. If they only want access to my checking account, then we don't actually have a relationship anyway. But what about the grandchildren? Don't you want to be part of their lives? And there it was, the final weapon in their arsenal. The threat to withhold my grandchildren unless I submitted to financial exploitation. Of course I want to be part of their lives, I said, but not at any cost. If the price of seeing my grandchildren is bankrupting myself to fund your lifestyle, then that's not love, it's extortion. The conversation ended badly, as I knew it would. Jennifer was angry, defensive, and completely unwilling to consider that her family might be treating me poorly. In her narrative, I was a selfish old woman who was choosing money over family. But I was beginning to understand that this narrative was necessary for them. If they acknowledged that I was a person with legitimate needs, if they admitted that their constant requests were unreasonable, if they recognized the magnitude of what I'd sacrificed for them, then they would have to change their behavior. It was easier to paint me as the villain than to examine their own actions. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop waiting for them to change, stop hoping they would eventually see me as a person worthy of consideration, stop trying to earn love from people who had already shown me exactly how much I mattered to them. I was going to build a life that didn't revolve around their approval or their needs. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I called the travel agent office in Astoria and asked about cruise packages. "What kind of experience are you looking for?" the agent asked. "Something I can afford on a pension," I said. "Somewhere warm. Something that feels like a celebration." She found me a 7-day Caribbean cruise leaving from Miami in 3 months. It wasn't luxury by any means, but it included meals and entertainment and the promise of sunrise over water I'd never seen. The total cost was exactly what I would have spent on one of Sarah's emergencies, but this time, the money would buy experiences for me instead of temporary solutions for someone else's poor planning. I booked it that day. For the first time in my adult life, I spent a significant amount of money on my own happiness without guilt, without second-guessing, without mentally calculating what my children might need that money for instead. It felt revolutionary. I spent the next few weeks preparing for the cruise with the kind of excitement I hadn't felt since childhood. I bought new clothes, not expensive, but new to me, and chosen for my own preferences rather than what was practical or invisible. I got my hair cut and styled. I bought a small camera to document my adventure. But the most significant change wasn't external. It was the gradual shift in how I saw myself. Instead of being a mother whose children didn't appreciate her, I started thinking of myself as a woman who'd spent decades sacrificing for ungrateful people and was finally choosing herself. The liberation was intoxicating. 2 weeks before my cruise, Sarah showed up at my apartment. I hadn't heard from her since our disastrous reverse mortgage conversation, and seeing her at my door brought back all the complicated emotions I'd been working to process. She looked older somehow, tired in a way that made me want to comfort her despite everything that had happened between us. "Can we talk?" she asked. I let her in, and we sat in my living room like polite strangers. The photos of her childhood were still on my walls, but they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about our relationship lately." I waited. "I know you feel like I don't appreciate everything you've done for me, and maybe I haven't been as grateful as I should have been." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard from her in years, and I felt the familiar tug of hope. "But I need you to understand that I never asked you to sacrifice so much. That was your choice. And now it feels like you're punishing me for decisions you made without consulting me." The hope died as quickly as it had emerged. She was apologizing for my feelings while refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing on her part. She was suggesting that my sacrifices had been unsolicited and that my current boundaries were punishment. "Sarah," I said carefully, "when you called me crying about losing your apartment, was I supposed to consult with you about whether to help? That's different. That was an emergency. And when you needed help with your credit card, or your car payment, or your medical bill, or your security deposit, were those all emergencies too? She was quiet for a moment. I never asked you to keep track of all that. I'm not keeping track to punish you. I'm keeping track to protect myself. Because somewhere along the way, I became someone who could be drained dry without anyone noticing or caring. That's not fair. Isn't it? Sarah, when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not as a prelude to asking for something, just because you cared about my well-being? She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. I can tell you exactly when it was, I continued. It was never. In the past 3 years, you have never called me just to see if I was okay. I'm busy, Mom. I have a life, a career, responsibilities. So do I. I work, I pay bills, I have worries and fears and dreams. But somehow my life only matters when it intersects with your needs. We sat in silence for several minutes. I could see her struggling, wanting to argue but unable to deny the basic facts of our relationship. What do you want from me? She asked finally. It was the same question Michael had asked, and I realized they both genuinely didn't understand what normal family relationships looked like. They'd been raised thinking that parents existed to serve children, that love flowed in only one direction, that my role was to give and theirs was to take. I want you to see me as a whole person, I said. I want phone calls that aren't requests. I want visits that aren't pickup appointments. I want to matter to you when I'm not useful to you. But what if I need help sometimes? Everyone needs help sometimes. But there's a difference between occasionally needing help and consistently expecting someone else to solve your problems for you. Sarah looked around my living room, taking in the small improvements I'd made since deciding to invest in my own comfort. A new lamp, some throw pillows, a small plant that hadn't been there the last time she'd visited. You seem different, she said. I am different. I don't know if I like it. That's okay. You don't have to like it, but you do have to respect it if you want a relationship with me. She left without saying goodbye, and I realized that we had just defined the terms of any future relationship we might have. I had drawn clear boundaries, explained my needs, and made it clear that continuing to treat me as a financial resource would end our contact entirely. Now it was up to her to decide what kind of daughter she wanted to be. The week before my cruise, something surprising happened. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door with an invitation to her grandson's birthday party. He is 8 years old, she said in careful English. Very good boy. He asks about nice lady next door who was hurt. You come? We have cake. I hadn't been invited to a child's birthday party in years, not since my own grandchildren had outgrown parties, or at least outgrown inviting me to them. The party was in Mrs. Chen's small apartment, filled with people I recognized from the hallways and lobby but had never really talked to. 3 generations of the Chen family, plus neighbors from several other apartments, all celebrating a little boy named David who spoke perfect English and translated between his grandmother and the other guests. David made sure I had cake and asked me about my cast, which had been replaced by a walking boot. He showed me his new art supplies and insisted I sign his birthday card collection. My grandma says you're very brave, he told me seriously. She says you got hurt, but you're getting stronger. I looked across the room at Mrs. Chen, who smiled and nodded at me like we shared a secret. For 2 hours, I was part of a family celebration where no one asked me for anything, where my presence was wanted rather than tolerated, where a child was genuinely happy to have me there. Walking back to my apartment that night, I realized that I'd been thinking about family all wrong. I'd been so focused on the family I'd been born into and the family I'd created through childbirth that I'd missed the family that had grown up around me through proximity and care. Mrs. Chen, who brought me soup when I was sick. Mr. Rodriguez, who did my shopping when I couldn't walk. Maria from the cafe, who saved my seat on Tuesday afternoons. David Chen, who asked about my injuries and signed my cast with a drawing of a rainbow. These people, who owed me nothing by blood or law, had treated me with more consistent kindness than my own children had shown in years. The night before my cruise, I packed my small suitcase with the same excitement I'd felt as a child before a special outing. I had 7 days of sunrise over the ocean ahead of me, 7 days of meals I didn't have to cook, and entertainment I didn't have to organize, and conversations with people who didn't know me as anyone's mother or anyone's resource. I would just be Eleanor, a woman on vacation, taking up space and enjoying herself without apology. But as I was folding my new clothes into the suitcase, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. Our last conversation hadn't ended well, and I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy for another confrontation. But curiosity won out. "Hi, Michael." "Mom, I heard you're going on some cruise." Jennifer must have been keeping tabs on me somehow, though I couldn't imagine how she'd found out about my trip. "Yes, I leave tomorrow morning." "Don't you think that's kind of irresponsible? Spending money on a vacation when your family is struggling?" There it was. Even my decision to spend my own money on my own happiness was being framed as a betrayal of family obligations. "Michael, my family isn't struggling. My adult children occasionally face the same financial challenges that all adults face, and they've gotten used to having someone else solve those challenges for them. That's not the same thing, isn't it? When was the last time you solved a financial problem without asking me for help first?" Silence. "I'm 72 years old," I continued. "I've worked for 55 years. I've raised 2 children, put one through college, and given away almost all of my savings to people who rarely express gratitude and never reciprocate care. If I want to take a cruise, I'm going to take a cruise." "Fine," he said, and his voice had that familiar edge of emotional manipulation. "But don't come crying to us when you run out of money and need help." The threat was unmistakable. If I spent my money on myself instead of on them, they wouldn't help me when I needed it. The irony was staggering. He was threatening to withdraw support he'd never provided in the first place. "Michael, when have I ever come to you for financial help?" Another silence. "When have I ever asked you to solve my problems for me?" That's different. It's not different. It's exactly the same. Except the flow of support has only gone in one direction for 30 years. After I hung up, I realized something that should have been obvious, but had taken me 7 decades to understand. My children didn't actually love me in any meaningful sense of the word. They loved what I provided for them. They appreciated what I sacrificed for them. They valued my usefulness to their comfort and security. But they didn't love me as a person with my own needs, dreams, fears, and limitations. They didn't see me as someone worth caring for, checking on, or considering. I was a function, not a person. A resource, not a relationship. And for the first time, that realization didn't devastate me. It liberated me. The cruise was everything I had hoped it would be and more. 7 days of waking up without obligations, of eating meals prepared by someone else, of watching sunrises over water that stretched to the horizon like liquid possibility. I met other women traveling alone, women with stories that echoed mine in surprising ways. Patricia from Phoenix, whose son had moved across the country and called twice a year. Helen from Boston, whose daughter had spent her inheritance while Patricia was still alive, and then complained about having to visit her in the nursing home. We shared stories, meals, and long conversations about the strange expectations placed on mothers, the guilt we'd carried for setting boundaries, the relief of finally choosing ourselves. On the 4th day, as we sat on deck chairs watching dolphins play in our wake, Helena said something that changed how I thought about everything that had happened to me. "You know what I realized?" she said. "We raised our children to be independent, successful adults, and then we act like it's a tragedy when they actually become independent and don't need us anymore. But that's not what happened to us, Patricia objected. Our children do need us. They just only need us for money. Exactly, Helena continued. We succeeded in raising adults, but we failed to raise people who knew how to love us back. And maybe that's partly our fault for teaching them that love meant endless giving without expecting anything in return. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the cruise. Had I taught my children that I didn't deserve consideration by never demanding it? Had I modeled relationships where one person gives and the other takes by never asking them to give back? It was a painful awareness, but also a freeing one. If I had taught them to treat me poorly, I could also teach them to treat me better, by refusing to accept anything less. The last night of the cruise, I stood on the deck watching the moon reflect on the calm Caribbean water and made a decision about the kind of life I wanted to live for whatever years I had left. I wanted relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided service. I wanted to spend my time with people who were genuinely happy to see me, not just happy to see what I could provide for them. I wanted to use my limited resources on experiences and connections that brought me joy rather than on fixing problems for people who would inevitably have new problems to fix. I wanted to matter to myself as much as I'd spent decades mattering to everyone else. Flying home to New York, I felt like a different person than the broken woman who'd been hit by that car 6 months earlier. I was still lonely sometimes, still disappointed in how my relationships with my children had turned out. Still grieving the family I'd thought I had. But I was no longer desperate. I was no longer willing to accept scraps of attention in exchange for financial support. I was no longer afraid of being alone because I'd learned the difference between solitude and abandonment. Solitude was what I'd experienced on the cruise, time alone with my thoughts, my dreams, and my own company. Abandonment was what I'd felt for years while surrounded by family members who saw me as a convenience. I much preferred solitude. Back in my Queens apartment, I immediately noticed changes that reflected my new priorities. The photos on my walls were no longer exclusively family pictures. I'd added images from my cruise, postcards from places I wanted to visit, small pieces of art I'd bought because they made me happy, rather than because they served some practical purpose. My refrigerator was stocked with foods I enjoyed rather than just essentials. My bookshelves held novels I'd bought for pleasure reading rather than just practical guides and religious texts. I had turned my apartment into a home for myself rather than a waiting room for visits from people who rarely came. 3 weeks after I returned from my cruise, Sarah showed up at my door again. She looked terrible, tired and stressed in a way that immediately activated my maternal instincts. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." I let her in, and we sat across from each other at my kitchen table like negotiators in delicate peace talks. "I've been thinking about everything you said before you left on your trip," she began, "and I'm wondering if maybe we can find some kind of compromise." My heart lifted slightly. Maybe the time apart had given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized that she wanted a real relationship with me rather than just access to my resources. "I'm listening," I said. "I know you felt like I was only calling when I needed help, and I can see how that would be hurtful. So I'm willing to make more effort to stay in touch just to talk." It was a promising start. "And I know you're worried about your financial security, which I understand. So I'm not going to ask you for money for smaller things anymore. Only real emergencies. Less promising, but still better than the previous dynamic. But right now, I am facing a real emergency, and I need your help." And there it was. I'm about to be evicted from my apartment. My landlord is selling the building and I can't afford first month, last month, and security deposit for a new place. I need $12,000 or I'm going to be homeless. $12,000. More than the cost of my cruise, more than I currently had in my checking account, more than I'd ever been asked for in a single request. "Sarah, I don't have $12,000. "You could get it. You could get a home equity loan, or borrow from your 401k, or something." She wanted me to borrow money to give to her. She wanted me to go into debt to solve her housing crisis. Why can't you get a loan? I asked. My credit is terrible because of all the credit card debt. What about Michael? Can he help? He doesn't have that kind of money. What about your friends? Other family members? Mom, you're my mother. This is what mothers do. There it was again. The assumption that my role in life was to solve problems I hadn't created with money I couldn't afford to give. Sarah, I went on a cruise that cost $1,500, and you called it irresponsible because my family was struggling. Now you want me to borrow $12,000 to pay your moving costs. That's completely different. The cruise was a luxury. This is a necessity. A necessity created by your own financial choices. Her face hardened. So you're just going to let me become homeless? I'm not letting you do anything. I'm declining to solve a problem that you created and that you're capable of solving yourself. How? How am I supposed to solve this myself? The same way millions of other adults solve housing problems. You get a second job. You find roommates. You move somewhere cheaper. You ask friends for help. You contact social services. You figure it out. I can't believe how cold you've become. Cold. Refusing to go into debt to fund her lifestyle choices was cold. Sarah, if I borrowed $12,000 to give to you, what would happen the next time you had a financial crisis? There wouldn't be a next time. There's always a next time, because you've never learned to live within your means, and you've never had to learn because I've always been there to fix it. We stared at each other across my kitchen table, and I could see the moment she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. Fine, she said, standing up, but don't expect me to come running when you need help someday. It was the same threat Michael had made, but this time I responded differently. Sarah, you've never helped me when I needed it. You didn't come to the hospital when I was hit by a car. You didn't check on me during my recovery. You didn't offer to help with groceries or cleaning when I couldn't walk properly. The idea that you might not help me in the future isn't a threat. It's a continuation of the status quo. She left without another word, slamming my apartment door hard enough to shake the walls. Sitting alone in my kitchen afterward, I felt surprisingly calm. The old Eleanor would have been devastated, would have stayed awake all night worrying about her daughter's living situation, would have probably called the bank in the morning to ask about loan options. But the new Eleanor understood something the old one never had. I was not responsible for the consequences of other people's choices, even when those people were my children. Sarah's housing crisis was the result of years of poor financial decisions enabled by my willingness to solve her problems for her. If I continued to bail her out, she would never learn to manage her own life, and I would never be free from the cycle of crisis and rescue that had defined our relationship. 2 months later, I learned that Sarah had solved her housing problem exactly the way I'd suggested. She'd found roommates, moved to a cheaper neighborhood, and gotten a weekend job to supplement her income. She was fine, just like I'd known she would be. The knowledge that she'd been perfectly capable of handling her own problems all along was both validating and heartbreaking. How many years had I spent solving problems she could have solved herself? How much of my life had I wasted playing rescuer to people who didn't need rescuing? But I didn't dwell on those questions for long. I was too busy planning my next adventure. With the money I wasn't sending to my children every month, I had signed up for a photography class at the community center. The instructor was a woman named Rosa, who had immigrated from El Salvador 30 years ago and spoke about light and composition with the passion of someone who'd found her calling late in life. Photography is about seeing, she told our small class on the first day. Not just looking, but really seeing. And to see clearly, you have to be present, not distracted by what was or what might be. It was exactly the philosophy I was trying to apply to my own life, being present in my own experience instead of constantly worrying about my children's dramas. I bought a good used camera and started taking pictures of my neighborhood with new eyes. The community garden where old men debated politics in Spanish, the sidewalk chess games outside the barber shop, the way afternoon light fell through the subway grating onto the faces of commuters. My world, which had felt so small and constricted when I was focused on my children's problems, suddenly seemed rich with possibility and beauty. One afternoon, while photographing the mural on the side of the grocery store, a young woman approached me. "Excuse me, are you a photographer?" "Amateur," I said, "just learning." "My grandmother lives in that building," she said, pointing to the brick apartment complex across the street. "She's 93 and doesn't get out much anymore, but she always sits by her window watching the street. I've been wanting to get some photos of the neighborhood to make her a photo book of the place she's lived for 40 years. Would you be interested in a project like that?" Her grandmother was named Mrs. Vasquez, and she turned out to be one of the most interesting people I'd ever met. She'd raised 6 children as a single mother after her husband died young, worked as a seamstress for 40 years, and had strong opinions about everything from local politics to the best methods for growing herbs on a fire escape. She hired me to document not just the neighborhood, but the stories that went with it. Which corner had the best gossip sessions? Where the teenagers gathered to practice dance moves? Which building had the most interesting lobby murals? For 6 weeks, I spent my afternoons walking the streets with my camera, talking to strangers, collecting stories and images that painted a picture of a community I'd lived in for decades but never really seen. Mrs. Vasquez paid me $300 for the photo book we created together, but the real payment was the sense of purpose I'd rediscovered. I was good at this. Not just the photography, but the human connection, the storytelling, the way I could put people at ease and capture moments that mattered. For the first time in years, I felt useful in a way that didn't involve sacrifice. Word about my photography project spread through the neighborhood network of grandmothers and shopkeepers. Mrs. Chen commissioned me to take portraits of her whole family during Chinese New Year. The owner of the Greek cafe asked me to photograph his restaurant's anniversary celebration. I wasn't getting rich, but I was building something that belonged entirely to me. A small business based on skills I'd discovered I had, relationships with people who valued my work, a sense of identity that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother or ATM. 6 months after Sarah's housing crisis, I got a call from Michael. It was the first time we'd spoken since my cruise, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "Mom, how are you doing?" "I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?" "Good. We're all good. Listen, I was wondering if you'd like to come to Emma's birthday party next weekend. She's turning 12, and she specifically asked if Grandma Eleanor could come." My granddaughter had asked for me specifically. The invitation wasn't filtered through Jennifer or offered grudgingly as an obligation. Emma actually wanted me there. "I'd love to come," I said. "Great. It's at our house on Saturday at 2. Nothing fancy, just cake and presents and some of her friends. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself. Oh, and Mom?" I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I wanted to say I'm sorry for how that went. I was angry about things that weren't really your fault. It wasn't a complete apology or a full acknowledgement of how they'd treated me over the years, but it was more self-awareness than Michael had ever shown before. "Thank you for saying that. I'll see you Saturday." Emma's birthday party was exactly what a child's birthday party should be: chaotic, joyful, and centered entirely around making a 12-year-old girl feel celebrated. Emma hugged me when I arrived and kept me updated throughout the party on which friend was which and what everyone thought of the decorations. "Grandma Eleanor, come see my room. I redecorated it myself." She pulled me upstairs to show off her newly reorganized bedroom, painted in colors she'd chosen and decorated with artwork she'd made. "Mom said you're a photographer now," she said. "That's so cool. Could you teach me sometime?" "I'd love to." "Really? You could come over after school sometime and we could walk around the neighborhood taking pictures. I bet I could show you some places you've never seen." The enthusiasm in her voice was infectious. This beautiful, creative child wanted to spend time with me not because she needed something from me, but because she was genuinely interested in learning something I knew how to teach. Later, as the party was winding down and other parents were collecting tired children, Michael approached me in the kitchen. "Emma really loves you," he said. "She talks about you a lot. I love her too. She's a wonderful kid. I know we haven't been good about staying in touch, and I know that's mostly my fault. I get caught up in work and the daily routine, and I forget to call people just to check in." It was another small moment of awareness, another crack in the defensive wall he'd built around his own behavior. "I understand life gets busy," I said, "but it would mean a lot to me if you called occasionally. Not when you need something, just to talk. I'd like that too. And Mom, I heard about your photography business. That's really great. I'm proud of you for trying something new." Proud of me. My 47-year-old son was proud of me for pursuing my own interests. It was a strange reversal of the traditional parent-child dynamic, but it felt genuine in a way our interactions hadn't for years. Driving home from that party, I realized that my step back from financial enabling hadn't destroyed my relationships with my grandchildren the way Sarah had threatened. If anything, it had made space for more authentic connections based on genuine affection rather than obligation. Emma wanted to learn photography from me because she thought it was interesting, not because her parents had forced her to spend time with the grandmother who paid for things. Our relationship was based on mutual curiosity and affection, which made it more rewarding for both of us. 2 weeks later, I got another surprise call, this time from Sarah. "Mom, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I realize I owe you an apology." I braced myself for another manipulation disguised as contrition, but something in her voice sounded different. "I found a therapist," she continued, "and we've been talking about family dynamics and patterns. She helped me see some things I wasn't seeing before." "Like what?" "Like how I learned to solve my problems by asking you to solve them for me, and how that probably prevented me from learning to solve them myself." It was the first time I'd ever heard her take responsibility for the pattern rather than just apologizing for my feelings about it. She also helped me understand that asking you to mortgage your apartment for my moving costs was completely inappropriate. I was in crisis mode and not thinking clearly, but that's not an excuse. I waited, not sure how to respond to this unexpected accountability. I handled my housing situation myself, like you said I could. It wasn't easy, but it also wasn't as impossible as I thought it would be. I found roommates, got a weekend job, and moved to Queens. I'm actually happier with my living situation now than I was before. I'm glad it worked out. The thing is, I realized that every time you solved a problem for me, you prevented me from figuring out that I could solve it myself. I thought I needed you because you always rescued me, but what I actually needed was to learn that I didn't need rescuing. This level of insight was completely unexpected from the daughter who'd accused me of brain damage for setting financial boundaries. Your therapist sounds very wise. She is. She also helped me understand something else. I never learned how to have a normal relationship with you because our relationship was always about me needing things and you providing them. I don't actually know how to just be your daughter without asking for something. The honesty was startling and refreshing. But I'd like to learn, if you're willing to teach me. I'd like to try having a relationship based on actually caring about each other instead of just financial transactions. I felt a flutter of the old hope, but this time it was tempered with caution. "What would that look like?" I asked. "I don't know exactly. Maybe we could start with me calling you once a week just to see how you're doing. Not to ask for anything, just to talk. And maybe I could visit sometimes without there being an occasion or a crisis. I'd like that. And maybe you could tell me about your photography business. I saw some of your pictures on Mrs. Chen's Facebook page, and they're really beautiful. I had no idea you were so artistic." Mrs. Chen had put my pictures on Facebook. The idea made me smile. "I'd love to show you my work." "Good. Are you free for lunch this weekend? My treat, and no agenda other than spending time together." We made plans to meet at a small restaurant in Astoria, the Greek place where Maria and I had our Tuesday coffee dates. It felt symbolically appropriate, introducing my daughter to a space that represented my new, independent life. The lunch went better than I'd dared to hope. Sarah asked questions about my photography, told me about her job and her therapy, and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. For 2 hours, we talked like two adults who enjoyed each other's company, rather than like a mother and daughter trapped in dysfunctional patterns. She didn't ask for money once. When we hugged goodbye outside the restaurant, it felt different from the perfunctory embraces we'd exchanged for years. There was warmth in it, and attention, and what felt like genuine affection. "I love you, Mom," she said, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how to show it." Walking home after that lunch, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. Being hit by that car had been traumatic and painful, but it had also shattered something in me that needed to be broken. My acceptance of mistreatment disguised as family obligation. The months of recovery had given me time to examine my relationships without the distraction of constant crisis management. The financial boundaries I'd set had forced my children to confront their own capabilities instead of relying on my constant rescue. And the space I'd created by stepping back from my role as perpetual problem solver had allowed room for different kinds of relationships to emerge. Sarah was learning to be a daughter instead of just a recipient of maternal services. Michael was learning to see me as a person with my own interests, instead of just a resource for his family's needs. Emma was getting to know me as an individual with skills to teach, rather than just the grandmother who showed up with birthday gifts. I was becoming a person instead of just a function. The transformation wasn't complete, and I knew there would still be challenges ahead. Old patterns don't disappear overnight, and the temptation to fall back into caretaking mode would always be there. But I had learned something invaluable. I was worth caring for, worth protecting, worth investing in. My needs mattered as much as anyone else's. My dreams deserved to be funded as much as other people's crises. A year after the accident, I was sitting in my favorite cafe with Maria, showing her photos from my latest project, a series of portraits of elderly immigrants in our neighborhood, when my phone rang. It was Sarah, calling for our weekly check-in conversation. "Hi, Mom. How was your day?" "Good. I finished the Vasquez family portrait project, and I had coffee with Maria. How was your day?" "Busy but good. I helped my roommate move some furniture, and I actually cooked dinner instead of ordering takeout. Small victories, right?" We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things: work, weather, a book she was reading, a documentary I'd watched. It was the kind of conversation I'd longed for during all those years when every phone call had been a request or an emergency. "Oh, before I forget," Sarah said, "Emma's school is having a photography exhibition next month, and she entered some of the pictures you helped her take. She's really proud of them. Would you like to come to the opening?" "I'd love to." "Great. And Mom, I know I've said this before, but I really am grateful for everything you've done for me over the years. Not just the money stuff, but everything. The way you raised me, the values you taught me, the love you showed me even when I wasn't showing it back. You're showing it now. That's what matters." After we hung up, I sat in the cafe for a while longer, watching the familiar rhythm of my neighborhood through the large windows. People hurrying home from work, children playing in the small park across the street, elderly men gathered around the chessboards, women chatting in small groups while their grandchildren fed pigeons. This was my life, not the life I'd planned when I was young, not the family relationships I'd dreamed of, not the financial security I'd hoped to achieve. But it was a good life, filled with genuine connections, meaningful work, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you matter to yourself. I thought about that text message Sarah had sent from her mother-in-law's spa day. "Let me know if she dies." At the time, it had felt like the cruelest possible response to my crisis, but now I could see it differently. That message had been the wake-up call I'd needed. It had shown me exactly how little I mattered to the people I'd been living for. and it had forced me to decide whether I was going to continue accepting that treatment or demand something better. In a strange way, it had been the beginning of my liberation rather than the confirmation of my abandonment. I finished my coffee and gathered my camera equipment, planning to walk through the community garden before the light faded. There was a story I was working on about urban farming, and the late afternoon sun would be perfect for capturing the way it filtered through the tomato plants and bean vines. As I walked home through the familiar streets of Queens, past the bodega where I'd first hung up on Sarah, past the bus stop where I'd been hit by that car, past all the ordinary places that had witnessed my transformation, I felt something I'd never experienced before in my 73 years. I felt free. Free from the endless cycle of crisis and rescue that had defined my relationships with my children. Free from the guilt of putting my own needs first. Free from the fear that setting boundaries would leave me alone and unloved. I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by a community of people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. And I wasn't unloved. I was learning, finally, to love myself. The woman who had lain on that cold asphalt a year ago, broken and bleeding while her phone buzzed with cruel indifference, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer, and more at peace than I'd ever thought possible. Someone who had learned that the most radical act a mother can perform is choosing to matter to herself. Looking back now, I see that every painful moment of that journey was necessary. The accident that forced me to confront my isolation, the cruel text that shattered my illusions, the financial boundaries that revealed the true nature of my relationships, the lonely months of recovery that taught me the difference between solitude and abandonment. All of it had been leading to this moment, walking through my neighborhood with my camera and my newfound freedom, heading home to an apartment that belonged entirely to me. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever realized that you were giving so much of yourself that there was nothing left for you? Have you ever had to choose between being loved and being respected? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, or if you think it might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Sometimes sharing our stories is the only way to remind each other that we're not alone and that we all deserve better than settling for scraps of love in exchange for our entire lives. Remember, you matter. Your needs matter. Your dreams matter. And it's never too late to start living like they do.